In Diablo 2, there is not only a history of magic find and PvP builds, but also notorious challenge builds. Though with the changes in 2.4, one such challenge build does function quite a bit differently, and has become significantly easier to use, and that is the Sacrifice Paladin, commonly called the Martyr. The big change to Sacrifice was the shift from a flat 8% self-damage to a decreasing self-damage based on the level of the skill, to a minimum of 1%, making it a much more progression-friendly setup as you make your way through the game. And while I plan to cover the starter version of this later, after some discussions on the Discord by Sunbro and Itos, I was curious just what a truly endgame version of this would feel like, and thus this video was born. And as always, if you have an interesting challenge build you'd like me to try out, mention it down below and I'll take a look at it, even if it is, like this one, simply a comment about one often neglected skill or challenge build. Anyway, stat-wise, we went with a fairly basic setup. Enough strength for gear, enough dexterity for max block after Holy Shield, and every last drop to spare in Vitality. You would think this would be because we're running Sacrifice, but the reality is this is just the standard setup for pretty much any melee paladin build. Though this is also a good demonstration of just how much the character screen lies as well, since we're actually doing closer to 6,000 damage per swing as opposed to the atrociously low amount it shows up there. Skill-wise, Sacrifice is obviously our first pick, since it's the essential theme of the Martyr build. That said, there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about this skill, but to keep it short, there's basically 3 things to keep in mind. 1, Sacrifice cannot crit. 2, the damage you receive is based off the physical damage you do, and 3, you cannot amplify or reduce the damage you take from Sacrifice. That said, you also don't take any damage from immunes because you're not damaging them either, so at least you're a little safe there. On top of that, we max out both the Sacrifice synergies to help our damage along, namely Fanaticism and Retribution. Retribution is something I do keep on my hotbar from time to time for this too, just for the corpse clearing mainly, but it does serve as a pocket rejuvenation potion in emergencies. Our main aura though is Fanaticism, which makes it a nice synergy for this thing because we're going to use it anyway, since we're going to be like maxing it regardless of what melee build we do. This is mostly just to get our attack speed up to a reasonable level if we want to use different weapons, but it also gives us attack rating and damage for both ourselves and our mercenary, which we desperately need. The last skill we dump a lot of points into is Holy Shield. This is because we want that block, since we're going to be using a skill that essentially eats life instead of mana, so it does get pretty important. Holy Shield also lets us use Smite in certain conditions, usually bosses, that may be a little bit more troublesome without investing a lot more into our attack rating boost, since Sacrifice isn't auto-hit by any stretch of the imagination, and does not get great attack rating boost itself either. Now, as far as our 1-point wonders, we do have Sanctuary, which we don't use a ton of the functions of, but it is exceptional when dealing with physical immunes such as ghosts or even physical resistant undead enemies, since it essentially forces their physical resistance to 0. Too bad it only works on undead. The knockback has the added advantage of giving you a clear path to things like greater mummies whenever you're in areas they spawn in, since it quickly shoves aside the skeletons, letting you charge in and then sacrifice to pretty much just 1 or 2 shot the greater mummies, preventing them from reviving all the skeletons. The other thing of note there that you may have noticed is Charge, which is our movement tech for this build, letting you rush from battle to battle while staying in the walking stance. You don't want to run with pretty much any melee paladin because you'll lose your blocking while you're moving. If you go into walk and use Charge to move around, you'll block all the time. This basically means that we use this to maintain our quick movement while doing that block chance, and it is a major boon, as we said, and it falls into a similar category to the Vampire form on Necromancers and Whirlwind on Barbarians, where it can greatly improve your durability regardless with little to no drawbacks. And a tip, if you want to use it on left click, hold down shift while using it and you'll dash towards your cursor, even without an enemy there. Now, you will have leftover points on this build, but not a ton, so I favored bumping up my maximum resist by putting hard points into the resist auras. But you could also easily go into a hybrid smiter with this and put the spare points into smite instead, or possibly even just go into zeal and become a zealot in the end. Now, as far as how we support this all with our mercenary, we're actually favoring an Infinity mercenary with Holy Freeze. In this case, with Fortitude and Vampire's Gaze, but really any resist and leech setup for armor and helmet work. The reason we're going for Infinity is because we seriously lack much in the way of attack rating boosts, and with our slower attack speed than say a Zealot or a Smiter, we want to make sure that every swing counts. As far as the aura, Holy Freeze, we went with it for 2 reasons. One, for the obvious slow effect it provides, but also as a source of non-physical damage for the select few non-undead physical immunes like Succubi. Equipment wise, we actually played it fairly safe, though after testing you could go with significantly punchier options without an issue thanks to that drop to 1%. You'll just want to be really aware of your attack speed breakpoints because Sacrifice is slow compared to the more common Paladin melee builds of Zeal and Smite. That said, I did end up going a bit overboard for Life Leech, but it was still fun basically doubling up on life tap sources, with the first one being the rune word Exile, a fairly popular Paladin-only rune word that packs a ton of badass mods. For this one, I used an old one with a resist base for durability purposes, but going the damage version would be fine too if you can cover the resistance gaps elsewhere. There's a ton of decent alternatives here, such as Herald of Zakarum, or even if going super cheap, a resistance-based spirit can do good enough. But I do think that Exile is the best choice for this type of challenge build. The other source of life tap is also the budget source in case you don't have an Exile, and that is Dracul's Grasp. If you have an Exile and want to use a slower weapon, this is one spot you could make up that speed. But since we're using a faster weapon, we can use pretty much whatever we want and take advantage of the life leech and extra life tap proc on these gloves. The second best I would say would probably be Blood Gloves, followed by probably Lava Gout because it gives attack rating through enchant, it gives you extra fire damage. There's a lot of nice things about Lava Gout, but it also gives you that 20% attack speed. Basically, yeah, unless they've changed something behind the scenes in Resurrected, percent to demons does not apply to the sacrifice damage, making laying of hands a bit less useful, so just getting ahead of that comment right now. In terms of the rest of our gear, it should be familiar to most Zealot players. In the rings, we're packing the dual leech we throw around, though I'd actually favor mana leech here if you do not have a decent dual leech option. This is because we need the mana for charge since it's our primary movement tech. The other ring is the fairly obvious Raven Frost for Cannot Be Frozen, which helps us keep our swing speed up as much as possible by preventing chill, while giving us a few other nice mods. On the belt, we're going T-God, since we all know I hate gloams, and frankly I wanted to mitigate them as much as possible since, due to bad luck lately, I cannot seem to escape them spawning on the test paths, both in Act 4 and Act 5, so I figured I'd get ahead of that train, though if you're going somewhere without gloams or lightning-heavy enemies, a String of Ears or Verdungos would work just fine here. Boot-wise, it's more of the melee paladin standard fare, with Gore Riders for the usual Crushing Blow and Bleed, though it is worth noting Deadly Strike does not work with Sacrifice, so we just ignore that for now. Though why I did not go with Goblin Toe is because I wanted the faster run walk since we are walking mostly while in clusters and we want to edge that speed up just a little bit. That's also why I opted for Cat's Eye rather than High Lords on the amulet because it gives the attack speed boost we need when swapped off of Fanaticism. Basically it's so we don't lose any speed while in Redemption or Salvation swaps, and it does give us that faster run walk. In the helmet we went with Guillaume's with an enhanced damage jewel that I stole off my Blade Fury Assassin, basically just to give us more Crushing Blow. There's a lot of options for this socket slot, and generally if going slower weapon you'd want attack speed jewels or a few other opportunities here for resists, other mods, stuff like that. It's just what I happen to have on hand and it worked good for this. There are better things you could throw in there. You could even do a Cham and give yourself Cannot Be Frozen so you can swap out the Raven Frost for something with even more attack rating. Now the reason I didn't go with the Resistance Guillaume is because we didn't really need more resist. We're packing a Chains of Honor. Yes, I know Enigma would give us more run walk, but I wanted the resist so I could pack more attack rating charms. This is also a nice mix of mods on top of those resists like life leech, damage reduction, plus skills, etc. It is unfortunate the damage to demons and undead isn't as punchy as we want, but it does still at least work with charge and such, but it is kind of wasted on sacrifice. And finally, the weapon I went with was Grief. Though there are several other options you could pack in there, Grief felt like the best one for me, easily outperforming Last Wish and Death in general use. There are of course heavier hitting options, especially as you move into the two-handed Martyr builds, but for one-handed it's hard to beat the attack speed, damage, and indestructible combo that is the Grief Phase Blade. Overall, I thought this build was a fun distraction. In the long run though, I think in terms of single hit skills, I would generally just prefer the heavy dump into charge, or if I'm doing something more standstill in a pack like this one is, Vengeance would be preferred. That said, a good reason to look at this build is with the changes in 2.4, Sacrifice has become much more feasible for the ramp into Zealot than it used to be, pretty much remaining just as powerful as before while still mitigating its drawbacks, and giving you a much stronger no respec route through the traditional Zealot than before. And as always, if you found this useful, hitting that like button or even just sharing your experience with a similar build helps out the channel a ton and tells YouTube, as well as me, that you would like to see more videos like this one.